Ashley Townshend is the Director of Foreign Policy and Defence at the United States Study Centre. Ashley, welcome.
Thanks very much, Patricia.
What is Beijing's play here in regards to Australia? What are they trying to achieve?
Well, look, I think that there are really two objectives here. There's the short-term one, which is about preserving China's reputation and pushing back against you can call it a narrative or you can call it reality that China was less than forthcoming at the outbreak of this crisis. And then there's their longer game, which is really about trying to prevent the collective action by countries in the region and countries in the world to essentially push back against China on this particular issue in the short term, but also on other issues as well. And here, their long-term play is about trying to separate US allies from each other, from other partners in the region and from Washington. And they do this through a combination, I think we can see in this case, of both disinformation as well as you alluded to just there, direct threats in this case.
China has warned, as we've been talking about, of an economic boycott if Australia continues its push for this inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. It's clear the Morrison government isn't backing down, and in fact they have the support. This is a bipartisan support around this from the Labor Party. How much of a game changer is this? Because, you know, I've been watching this issue over the last few years, and it seems to me that the language we're now hearing from both the Morrison government and the Labor Party in opposition is actually genuinely different, a muscling up to China like we've never heard before.
Look, I think that's right. I would potentially not couch it as a muscling up, simply because I think that denotes assertive behaviour. And I think here what it is that Australia is seeking, as you say, in a bipartisan way, is what all reasonable countries should expect, which is a fair and legitimate non-political inquiry into a global health crisis. We may not live in a world where that is possible, and that's something we ought to know about, but surely it's legitimate for us to at least pursue this sort of objective. Now, to your point about the change in language, I think you're right. Over the last 5 or 6 years, we've definitely seen much more comfortable bipartisanship when it comes to this particular issue. Now, it's not the Labor Party and the government are in complete lockstep here. There has still been some issues where they disagree, but by and large, it's true to say that both don't want to be the brunt of Chinese economic coercive threats, which in this case and highly unusually have been made very clearly by the Chinese ambassador Chang Jingye to Australia. Normally, we talk about grey zone coercion because it's not clear if China is letting our wine sit in vats on a dock somewhere in China or is not taking as much Australian coal and again letting that sit on a dock somewhere, or in fact whether there's just some hiccup and really China's not actually exercising any coercion. This time, he said that there could be a consumer boycott, and we should take that as being not just a warning, but a threat that, in fact, China does have levers at its disposal, which it can use and has used in the past.
Australia's stance on China has been evolving, and it predates COVID-19. COVID-19, I feel, has accelerated that change. And we are having a conversation now in this country, as much as we can, given we are literally in the middle of a pandemic, but about changing that economic relationship with China and not being so dependent on that economic relationship. Is that change going to be vital to changing the political dimensions as well?
I think it will change the political dimensions, and I think it's going to come regardless of how this particular bilateral dispute peters out or plays out, rather. And it may peter out, it may play out. There was, as you say, already a talk about decoupling economies from China in order to reduce the bandwidth, really, for China to exercise coercive leverage, whether that be economic or other forms of informational leverage or technology theft. And this has been spearheaded by Washington in a very aggressive way in this administration. But I don't think it would be fair to say that this has been a US-led call to arms. Many countries in the region have had similar objectives. Japan has already put up a large amount of money in around the $100 billion mark to reshore supply chains in Japan to prevent exposure internationally to China and other countries with regards to crises or coercive action. action. So this is accelerating now. And I think that you're right. The outcome of COVID-19 is going to strengthen the calls, not just to increase resilience by onshoring and diversifying supply chains of critical health supplies and other critical national assets and commodities, but what it's also going to do is sharpen this debate about factoring in the strategic externalities to what business does on a day-to-day basis, which is to place essentially the corporate interests of Australia at the front and centre of their objectives. That's their role, and they shouldn't be criticised for it. But there is a need for a debate about where regulation and where corporate actions are not in the national interest and have to have those national interests factored in the same way as we've seen throughout the 90s and 2000s, the factoring in of environmental externalities into corporate behaviour. So this is really a big change.
Ashley, we've only got a couple of minutes left, but some breaking news. The Chinese embassy has done something quite extraordinary. It's essentially doubling down on its attacks. But it's also alleging, and this is key here, that the DFAT secretary admitted in her briefing to them that now is not the time to commence this review, and Australia has no details of this proposal. This is essentially, just to be clear with our viewers as well as to you, the Chinese embassy leaking on a confidential briefing with the head of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I would call it a pretty dramatic escalation. What do you think is motivating this? Because that's really inflaming the tensions.
Look, I think that that's certainly going to inflame tensions. A couple of points are worth bearing in mind here. First is the Chinese embassy and China in general on this issue, I think is feeling a lot of pressure because however this plays out, it almost beggars belief that other countries in the region and other countries in the world are not at some point going to join Australia in calling for an independent inquiry to the world's worst global health crisis in recent memory. So I think they realise that's going to happen and they're sort of moving into emergency mode to try and shape the narrative in a productive way. Second, no one in Australia has called for a review to begin right now. That is itself not the request that either Senator Payne or Senator Wong have made over the past 10 days. And to mischaracterise Australia's actions as calling for an immediate response, drop everything, forget the pandemic response, and let's look into blaming China, is just really the sort of heart of Chinese disinformation here. And very finally, Patricia, because I know we're nearly out of time, the issue here about disinformation and miscasting Australia's request really goes back to this point about Beijing's playbook. Whether it's the South China Sea, whether it's the Uyghurs in Western China, whether it's the UNCLOS ruling or something else, China typically tries to firstly discredit Australia by saying that it's following Washington's rules, then to criticise Australia to say that it's behaving irresponsibly and as opposed to being pragmatic. It then positions itself as the more pragmatic partner. And in this case, it's ended with criticising the Australian media for actually sowing disinformation, when in fact, I think for the most part, the Australian media has been trying to pick up on all the disinformation that's out there.
Yeah, and leaking on a call with the head of DFAT, extraordinary stuff. Ashley, thank you so much for coming on the program. Ashley Townshend, the Director of Foreign Policy and Defence at the United States Studies Centre.